Washington, Tacoma, USA. Professor Suagran is Gary E. and Jones A. Milcard Endowed Dean for the Milcard School of Business at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He is Secretary General of the Asian Academic Accounting Association and past President of the American Accounting Association's International Accounting Section. Professor Suragaran has served on the editorial boards of the Accounting Review, Accounting Horizons, and Issues in Accounting Education, and as Associate Editor of the Journal of International Accounting Research. He currently serves as Consulting Editor of the International Journal of Accounting, Auditing, and Performance Evaluation, and on the editorial boards of several other journals. Professor Sodagran will tell us all about corporate social responsibility, research evidence on the business impact. I had the pleasure of talking to Professor Sodagran just before this session, and we discussed several points which he may have not taken into consideration in his presentation, and I hope that he will have some comments on that in his presentation. So I leave the floor now to Professor Sodagran to talk to you about corporate social responsibility, and I hope that you are going to have a very interesting sessions, and I hope also that we may have some active participation in discussion which follows his presentation. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to be here at Cairo University's first conference on international accounting issues. When we first connected a few months ago, we discussed several possibilities of what I might present at this conference. We discussed several possibilities of what I might present at this conference, and we kind of agreed on looking at kind of a big picture of CSR research. Now, this morning we heard a wonderful presentation from Professor Mike Shields on management accounting. The difference here is that CSR research is a much younger field in the areas of accounting and finance. Right? So much of the papers you'll see are fairly recent papers. But nonetheless, it is an area that is growing in interest and in importance, both in the academic world and in the corporate world. At my university, we have a Center for Leadership and Social Responsibility, which the Milgard family endowed for us. And so we do a number of activities for the academics, for the business community, and for the students. We do an annual academic research conference every summer. We do a conference for the business community, typically in late winter, early spring. And then we do a case competition, a national case competition on CSR for bachelor students across the country, and hoping, inshallah, that we might take it to a global case competition in a few years. So that's just a little bit of background. I full disclosure, haven't done much work in CSR yet. In my capacity as dean, there wasn't much time to, but I hope that in the future I'll be able to actually get involved in doing papers. We've started a few projects and we'll see where they go. Okay, quickly about the University of Washington. You know, common mistake or confusion is that we are in Washington, D.C. We're not in Washington, D.C., we're on the other side of the U.S., in the state of Washington. So that's the northwest corner of the U.S. The main city that you may have heard of is Seattle. Some companies I think you may have heard of. Seattle? Yes. And you may have heard of some of the companies. We have some small companies based in our area like Boeing, Amazon, Microsoft, and your favorite Starbucks. So these are all companies that are based in Seattle, greater Seattle area. Okay, so with that, let me kind of proceed with the presentation. As I said, what we're looking at mainly is kind of a review of the research. Let me start by saying this is not a comprehensive review. I'm not saying that this covers everything that's been done in the field. I chose to kind of provide a sampling of CSR research in kind of accounting, finance, auditing, in those areas that we as accounting academics look at. And I try to organize them by certain, if you will, topics. You know, from my perspective, and when we talk to the corporate folks who come to that annual conference of ours, I need a sense to reason that, you know, there is the part about, oh, do CSR activities of the corporation because it's the right thing to do. Anytime you get into kind of, you know, moral and social values, you know, what's the right thing to do for one person may not be the right thing to do for another person. Just a current episode, if you've been watching the news for the last 2-3 weeks with the refugee crisis in Europe, you got very different responses from different countries, right? And so, beyond it being the right thing to do, there has to be an economic rationale for companies to take on the effort and the investment that is involved in CSR activities. There has to be some kind of an economic return. Or there has to be regulations. So what you see in that outline, the first 8 items are just going through different types of CSR research on different topics. And then the last one I thought might be of interest to you, where we look at an environment where there are actual regulations, where it is not voluntary, it is not the choice of one company to say, I'm going to do it, and another company to say, no, I'm not going to do it, right? And so I think those are kind of at least 2 of your possibilities. Either there's an economic rationale for doing it, the company sees some returns on their CSR activity, whatever those returns might be careful. I'm not just talking stock price or dollars and cents. You know, it may be their image, it may be other things, right? But they must see some return. Everything in life is cost-benefit analysis, and so they must see some return from that investment in order to keep doing it. I mean, you can do it, you can start it for a year or 2, it sounds good, but if the executive team doesn't find a positive cost-benefit outcome from that, they're likely to back off, right? So it's either that, or it's, you know, the parliament, the society as a whole decides that this should be a mandatory thing, a required thing by law that companies ought to do. Okay, so that's just some kind of context in terms of this activity. Okay, I will try to move kind of briskly on these articles. Some of them you may have encountered. And so the first part that, you know, in the outline that I thought we'd look at is this whole business of CSR and the cost of capital, right? Is there empirical evidence that companies that engage in CSR, in this case, they looked at CSR reporting, that they engage in CSR reporting. I I don't know enough about Egypt to know how prevalent or widespread that is, but we can discuss that during the question time. The range of involvement in providing CSR reports, and then just last week I attended a conference in New York on the audit of CSR reports, right? So one step is to provide a report and put it out there, and then just like the financial report, people may have some credibility issues with that report, especially because the whole activity is voluntary. And so now you see increasingly companies getting their CSR report audited. Now when I say increasingly, that's a broad statement. It's much more prevalent in Europe than it is in North America. I'm talking about the audit of CSR. But this paper just looked at companies that provide CSR reports. So, they had a pretty good sample size. They looked at a pretty reasonable window in terms of, the period during which companies did their first CSR report. And they found that firms with a high cost of equity capital in the previous year tend to initiate disclosure of CSR activities in the current. So what they're finding is that companies are either anticipating or maybe hoping that providing CSR activities helps in terms of their cost of capital. And so what they found is that initiating firms, that means firms that provided a CSR report the first time, right? For the first time, kind of almost like an event step. They enjoyed a subsequent reduction of about 1.77% in the cost of equity capital. And then going on quickly, firms exploit the benefit of a lower cost of capital associated with the initiation of CSR disclosure. Initiating firms are more likely than non-initiating firms to raise equity capital following the initiation. So one thing is the cost, the other is just going out there and raising the capital. And then among firms raising equity capital, initiating firms raise a significantly larger amount than do non-initiating firms, right? So these group of colleagues have done quite a few studies on CSR, and several of them have been published in the accounting review. This one again looked at a fairly large, still in the area of cost of capital. They looked at a pretty good sample size too, almost a similar time frame as the other study, and they found that firms with better CSR scores have lower cost of equity capital, so kind of consistent with the other one. And then they looked at other things too, including responsible employee relations, environmental policies, product strategies, contribute substantially to reducing the firm's cost of equity. So yes, it's all of that bundle of activities, right? Participation in two sin industries, tobacco and nuclear power, increases firms' cost of equity capital. And there might be an element of a risk premium over there, right? Because especially in the US, tobacco is taboo, and so there are a lot of tobacco lawsuits. And then nuclear is nuclear, right? That can be highly risky. And then their findings support arguments in the future that firms with socially responsible practices have high valuation and lower risk. Here's yet another one, and I'm not going to go through the whole slide. They looked at, this is in the Journal of Accounting and Public Policy this year. They looked at the period 2000-2004, and they were looking at the impact of voluntary environmental disclosure and firm value. So they found that when firms examined from 5 industries and 3 industry types, environmentally sensitive, they came up with these labels: environmentally sensitive, non-environmentally sensitive, environmentally sensitive but regulated, right? So that's the difference between the first bullet and the third bullet. If you have an environment, a market where these environmentally sensitive industries are not regulated, that might produce a different outcome than they are. So again, they found that the quality of voluntary environmental disclosures is incrementally negatively associated with firms' cost of equity capital. Now I want to make sure we understand, right? Negative, we're just talking about the sign negative. Negative not as in bad, but negative as in a lower cost of capital. This finding was more significant for firms in environmentally sensitive industries. Yeah, because I'll just say the name of one company, and I won't say anymore, BP. right? I shouldn't say any more than that. You know everything that's gone on with BP, and you know the billions and billions and billions of dollars that it has cost them. Right? Here's another study, also in the Journal of Accounting and Public Policy, looking at cost of capital. Here they also looked at the issue of governance and so on and so forth, right? And again, all of these different things, one might say are proxies for risk. So therefore, the higher. Right? So there's more than just being good as a company, being socially responsible. For that person on Wall Street, who may or may not care about that aspect of it, their rationale in terms of measuring risk has got to be one of, if there is a problem, if there is an accident, then what is that prospective liability going to be, right? So that's kind of the bottom line, even if you don't care about being good or being whatever, right? Okay. Here again, this was in AOS. This one's been published for a while there. They looked at the interrelations among environmental disclosure, environmental performance, and economic performance. When this work first started, a lot of it was environmental based, right? Everything was about environmental costs and so on and so forth. Now, of course, CSR is taking a much bigger perspective, and of course, a lot of it is industry specific. And what do I mean by that, right? We see that just where we are in Seattle. For some companies, it's how they treat their employees and employee safety and so on and so forth. For Starbucks, a big issue is where they source their raw material, coffee, and how are those coffee farmers treated, right? For Amazon, it might be something else, and so it really depends on. CSR is now a much bigger umbrella than just environmental, right? So these colleagues found that good environmental performance is significantly associated with good economic performance, and also with more extensive quantifiable environmental disclosures of specific pollution measures and occurrences. So when you get to that CSR report, right, there's always the question: what are the performance measures that ought to be included in the CSR report based on the stakeholders' interests, right? And different stakeholders may have very different interests, right? Some might, again, care about, labor unions might care about how labor is treated. Environmentalists obviously care about how, what the company is doing in terms of its environmental footprint, and on and on and on, right? And so, here they found that, those two, good environmental performance and good economic performance, they go together, but the question is, one, what should you disclose? And companies, at least in the US, are still grappling with that. What should you disclose? And two, how do you provide credibility to what you have disclosed? Because again, since it's voluntary, some companies do it, some companies don't, and they said earlier, some companies get it audited, some companies don't. So it's a mixed bag, and in terms of credibility, these things do matter. Then here's a study in Capital Management Review about the CSR and financial performance. Okay. And they looked at the largest US companies, the S&P 500, about a 15-year window, and then found that stock price response used as a proxy for firm's reputation declined significantly less following an adverse event than a product recall when the firm is engaging in CSR. So there's an element of loyalty, if you will, brand loyalty, which is what this one is kind of heading towards. If customers, if stakeholders, their experience has been that this is a good company, in quotes, everybody's perception of good might be different, they are less likely to penalize the company when something bad happens. then the company has had a history of, we just call it bad behavior, right? So that's what this one is. Here again, they're once again looking at CSR and financial performance, using DLD data for unrelated companies, IO period, and so on. And what their results seem to suggest is that while CSR initiatives in certain areas may have a negative impact on corporate performance, I want to be clear, there is no, I'll go back to that migrant and refugee crisis in Europe example. There is no agreement as to what is the right thing to do, right? I mean, here in the hotel, you have all those different channels: the German channel, the French channel, obviously BBC, the British channel, and those debates that watching before I go to bed every night till I fall asleep with a jet lag. There are very different perspectives on that. So similarly over here, there are some very different perspectives on this whole thing. So there are those who believe, and this is our first keynote presentation yesterday, the age-old Milton treatment thing that's only about shareholder wealth maximization. There are some who believe that this is not a good use of shareholders' resources. There are others who think no. And that's why I think this body of work is going to be important, because even the people that are hardcore Wall Street types are going to want to see an economic reason for doing this rather than just good. Here's another one. Okay, again. Here's a working paper. This came from that conference that I said we do at our campus every summer. This was a colleague from Peru who attended the conference and presented this paper, right? And so he was looking at companies that have, a lot of countries have these awards for financial reporting, CSR reporting, all that kind of stuff. And so that's how he kind of looked at it from a Peruvian sample. And what he found was that responsible companies have a much higher ROE than not very responsible companies. And then goes on to look at it by industry. Albeit a very small sample size, I want to make that. It's a very small sample size. It's country specific, but it's useful to look at what's going on in different environments, because everything is not about the US and Europe. So then we move on to CSR disclosure and the audit function. And this gets into that question that I alluded to at the start of our conversation today, which was, okay, I'm doing my CSR report. Now, do I need to get external assurance or external audit, right? I was at a GRI conference 2 years ago in Amsterdam, and had an opportunity to visit with the CFO of Heineken. And as you know, Heineken is a Dutch company. So I just asked him what was their thought process in deciding to get their sustainability report, CSR report, whatever you want to call it, audited. And it was very interesting what he said. He said, for us, one, the cost is not that great, obviously for a company that size, right? But two, you also saw getting the CSR report audited as an insurance policy against lawsuits. So, if somebody were to sue them because there were some inaccuracies in the CSR report and so on, then the auditors had a chance to look at it, and the auditors provided the report. So maybe the liability shifts to the auditors rather than to the company. So on the audit function side, right, this notion of voluntarily purchasing assurance services and the choice of the assurance provider. So they find that companies seeking to enhance the credibility of their reports and build their corporate reputation are more likely to have their CSR reports audited. Companies in stakeholder-oriented countries are more likely to have their CSR reports audited. as opposed to purely stockholder-related countries. That's the distinction they make between stakeholder and stockholder. And then companies based in countries with weak legal, environmental, and social risks are more likely to choose a member of the auditing profession as their assurance provider. And this was part of a very robust discussion at that conference that I attended in New York last week, because obviously the public accounting firms, the Big Four or the non-Big Four public accounting firms, they feel that they have more credibility and they know the client firms better and so on. So they should be the ones doing the audit. But then when you actually look at the GRI numbers, and you can get on the GRI website and see that for yourself, there are lots of other entities that provide the assurance or the audit of CSR reports. So it's not a given that a company is automatically going to choose one of the Big Four. In fact, I'll just give you Starbucks as an anecdote. It doesn't mean one thing or the other. Then there are some companies who will decide to choose a separate auditor to audit their CSR report than the auditor that does their financial. Okay. So Starbucks, their financial report, I believe, is audited by Deloitte, but their CSR report is audited by Moss Adams, which is a Pacific Northwest firm, accounting firm, but very large. They are bigger than all of the Big Four in the Seattle market. So Starbucks is based there. They use them for the audit of the CSR report as opposed to, again, until there are regulations, all sorts of practices can be observed. Here's another one, financial analysts from Australia, US, and Asia. They look at the difference in the credibility of CSR reports depending on whether they're assured in the type of audit. Right? So still on that same subject. And they find, and surprise, surprise, that there is greater credibility when it is audited or assured, and when the auditor is a professional accountant. And then, talk about US financial analysts. They don't see any difference on who the auditor is. Yet another one on the audit function. This one kind of again gets to that economic aspect of it, right? So similarly, when you're talking about the CSR reports and you're doing them or not doing them if it's voluntary, this gets to cost-benefit analysis in terms of getting it audited or not getting it audited. And so here, what they found was auditors tend to charge lower audit fees to client firms with superior CSR performance. Again, that whole issue of risk, right? Auditors are less likely to issue a going concern opinion to client firms with superior CSR performance, and they're less likely to resign from client firms with superior CSR performance. So there it is. There's some more economic rationale, perhaps, to get the CSR report. I mean, I'm not advocating that. I'm just telling you based on the findings. Here's another one that looks at that. Looking at evidence that both positive and negative CSR have a significant effect on the risk of firms and indicate that managers would be amiss if they did not include CSR considerations when designing the overall strategy for their firms. Christine, I don't know if Christine is here today. No. Christine made some comments yesterday that, and I'm putting my spin on it, but that, the younger generation today, whatever term we want to use, the millennials and so on and so forth, that, in business schools, we've kind of brainwashed them. She didn't use the word brainwash, I'm using that word. Where all they care about is, dollars and cents and so on. But it's really interesting, that is not necessarily the case at all. What we find, I just use Microsoft as an anecdote. When we talk to Microsoft and say, so, what's the deal? Why are you doing this? Why are you investing on? They call it corporate citizenship. Different companies call it different things. And they were the first time that was the first time I heard a company say that. But then subsequently, I've heard it in many different forums. Young graduates from college, whether it's bachelor's or MBAs, are asking those questions all the time, and it is an important variable for them in choosing where they want to work. So thank God for the young, that they are actually asking those questions. And so, if companies want to be competitive in the labor market, then if for no other reason, they want to have a menu of programs to show that they are doing stuff. Now again, we can get into a discussion of, is that greenwash, is this real? And that's where the audit function, I think, comes in. The audit function just gives it a little more credibility, at least in the veracity of the numbers provided. Now you might argue, again, if there's no mandatory reporting regime, you might argue that, but they should have been providing disclosure on this or that or the other. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. We're just talking about the same CSR report with an audit and without an audit, right? That's what we're talking about. So, then we get into kind of this realm of analyst forecast accuracy. This is essentially the same team of colleagues, Dan Dhaliwal from University of Arizona, Lee Radhakrishnan is at UT Dallas, and then the other two I think used to be his PhD students, Dan's PhD students. So they have yet another one, which also was published in the Accounting Review, looking at CSR disclosure and analyst forecast accuracy. I'll just go straight to the results. They find that the presence of standalone CSR reports is associated with significantly lower analyst forecast error. Such a relationship is strong among countries that are more stakeholder oriented. That theme keeps coming through. And the relationship is also strong among firms and countries with more opaque financial disclosure, suggesting that social disclosure complements financial transparency. This is kind of interesting, right? So in an environment that is not very transparent, stakeholders will turn to the CSR report to see if they can, shine more light on the company's activities and prospects and, forecast earnings and so on and so forth. This paper is now we move to the tax impact, and I'll move faster on this. CSR and corporate tax aggressiveness, and again, this was widely discussed in that conference last week. So they find that the higher the level of CSR disclosure, the lower is the level of corporate tax aggressiveness. Now, again, I'm not making any value judgments. I'm just reporting what they looked at and what they found. Warren Buffett says, "Hey, I'm gonna comply with the law, and if the law is not good enough, then that's not my job to change the law. That's Congress's job to change the law, right?" So there is that perspective too. Social investment commitment and corporate CSR strategy are important elements of CSR activities that have a negative impact on tax investments, right? So people have looked at that aspect of them. Here's another one about tax impact, again, in the interest of time. Scroll forward. Here's yet another one, a relationship between measures of CSR and the amount of corporate taxes paid and the amount invested in tax lobbying activity. I know Dave Gunther has done work on transfer pricing and all of that too. So kind of looking at that from the perspective now of CSR. And they find that CSR is negatively related to 5-year cash effective tax rates and positively related to tax lobbying expenditures, suggesting that on average, CSR and tax payment act as substitutes. So that's kind of interesting. Then there is the whole arena of human resources, and I kind of alluded to that in that comment 3 minutes ago, where more and more employees or prospective employees care about this. What's your environmental footprint? How are you treating your employees? Are you a good citizen in your community, however you define your community, right? Amazon is their community, Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, or is it a global community? So however you define community. But that's, I don't know if you ever have occasion to look at the New York Times, but the New York Times did a story just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe longer, but not much longer than that, where they took a hard look at Amazon, and basically the reporter's view was that Amazon treats its employees not too well in terms of their work hours and so on and so forth. So, the HR aspect of this is also relevant. Here is another one.
Again, frontline employees identified with the organization and customers as a function of how much the employees perceive management and customers to support the company's CSR activities. Effects are stronger among employees whom CSR is already tied to their sense of self. I don't want to make much generalizations, but having two daughters, 22 and 24, I certainly see it in them and the choices they make. So there's kind of an element of that. And then this one gets into kind of CSR and factors that impact companies' disclosure level. And so here what I did was I just took a sample of studies from different environments, if you will, different countries. So the first one is based on Canadian manufacturing firms. The other one is New Zealand companies. Define size and industry are positively associated with level of environmental disclosure. And then companies that list abroad, that's the dual listing, dual overseas stock exchange listing, are greater disclosures of social and environmental information. Now, of course, that depends on where these companies list. If they list in environments where that is an expectation of the domestic companies in those countries, then yeah, you got to do it. Otherwise, why bother to go to that country? If you're going to another environment where this is not required, then so it does matter as to where it is that this foreign listing is based. Here's another one about looking at, again, kind of the dirty industries or the environmentally sensitive industries, positive association between environmental performance and the level of discretionary environmental disclosures. The next one is about a sample from China. And this was interesting. I find that better performing firms are more likely to disclose CSR activities and to produce higher quality of CSR reports compared to their worst performing counterparts. Now that we're not making any causality statements over here in terms of which drives one drives the other, but that's the relationship we observed. And then the link between firm performance and CSR disclosure was found to be weaker among state-owned enterprises compared to non-state-owned enterprises. That's kind of an interesting finding. So if you're a state-owned enterprise and you have the protection from the government, then maybe you feel less inclined to get your capital from the government and so on. You feel less inclined to do this than companies that are actually raising their capital in the competitive capital markets. Okay, this one I'll kind of move through. So these are a couple of colleagues. Rafael Nazali is in Vancouver, Canada, and so this one looks at communication processes for CSR stuff. So obviously not empirical, but these are the labels that they've put on. So there's transactional, which is a one-way information flow. So that's the company putting it out there to maybe some intermediaries like trade groups and so on and so forth, and then it makes its way to other stakeholders. So that's kind of a one-way flow. Then there is this two-way symmetrical, as they call it, which is hopefully the stakeholders, if they care, then they provide their input to the company as to what they would like to see in addition to what the company perhaps is already disclosing. If they find that's insufficient disclosure, there's not enough transparency and so on. So that's the transitional. And then there is what they call transformation, which is you got a whole bunch of stakeholders. I'm sorry for that. Over the S's, you see all the various constituents. And this, as I hope you notice, is a two-way street that they go back and forth with each other. So it's almost a negotiation process. Okay, so that was kind of a quick, as I said, a very quick overview of the emerging research on CSR. Different companies and different countries are at very different levels of this stuff. At that conference, sorry? Because they're the only ones that I know that have a law, which I'll talk about. So remember earlier when I started, I said it can either be voluntary or you can be mandatory. And India passed a law 2 years ago where certain CSR things are not voluntary anymore. Every publicly listed company that meets the criteria, and I'll talk about that in a second, has to do this. Right? Otherwise, they would be in violation. So, this is called the Companies Act of 2013. In India, the legal system and the legislative system and the justice system, they all move very, very slowly. So things take a long time to happen. So we look at how CSR impacts the business, making CSR activities strategically effective, and then trying to garner external resources. So very quickly on the law. In August 2013, the Indian Parliament passed the first corporate law updating the Act of 1956. So you can see things move slowly. Modernizing and aligning the law to global standards. It's really interesting, there is kind of maybe a stereotype or an expectation that, it's the economically developed economies of Europe and North America that do more of this. But as I get more into this area, I find, and again at that conference 2 weeks ago, they had kind of a slide which showed what percent of companies are doing this and so on. That was about the audit of the CSR report. I think India ranked #1 in terms of the percentage of companies that are getting their CSR reports on it. Now again, I'm not saying they're doing it because they are holy or they're better or whatever. Maybe there are laws that are requiring them to do this, or they're preparing to implement this law, right? South Africa is another one. South Africa seems to be very actively engaged in this arena. And so, yeah, some emerging market economies are actually very far along in this whole activity of CSR reports and the audit of CSR reports. Anyway, so coming back to this, increased decision-making powers for the company, additional rights and protections for minority shareholders, and then this mandatory CSR spend. That's what I wanted to just kind of share with you. And again, not saying it's good or bad. The law is very young, so we'll see how it's actually implemented. It's one thing to pass the law; it's another thing to see how it's implemented. And they're very early in that process. So it'll be a few years before we actually get good evidence on that. But basically, this is what it is, right? So every company that meets the following financial strength criteria is mandatorily required to spend 2% of average net profits in the last 3 years on specified CSR activities outlined in the revised Schedule 7. I'm sorry about that term crore. That's a very Indian term. But what it is 10 million. So a crore is 10 million, right? And so they kind of tell you what kind of criteria triggers that 2% requirement, right? So then how is it supposed to be handled? Well, the company has to constitute a CSR committee of the board, 3 or more directors having at least 1 independent director on the CSR committee. They're required to formulate and recommend CSR policy, recommend CSR activities and expenditure, the same, monitor CSR policy from time to time. So this is now a new committee that is not typical in most other countries, or at least maybe voluntary in some other countries. But now it's mandatory for all publicly listed companies that meet the requirements of the previous slide. So this is what the board has to make sure that happens. Disclose composition of the CSR committee, approve CSR policy and report, ensure CSR activities are undertaken by the company, ensure spending on CSR activities and reporting on non-compliance. Okay? And then they tell you failure to report, a lakh, L-A-K-H, is 100,000. Okay? So a crore was 10 million, a lakh is 100,000. Okay, so here are, things that companies are now grappling with in India because it's a fairly new law. And this part, understand what constitutes CSR activities. Let me just talk about that for 30 seconds. It's very interesting. The law is pretty stiff on this. And again, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, understanding what the law says. So the company spends internally. So let's say they're investing in a more energy efficient, whatever, heating system, whatever. They don't consider that. They don't count that for the CSR. Because they say, if you're doing that for yourself, that's flowing down to your bottom line. So it's good that you're doing it, but that won't count. So it has to be for external constituents. You have to demonstrate that the CSR spend, the 2% spend, is not related to things that you're doing to enhance your own performance. Now again, that's a matter of opinion whether that's good or bad. In the US, we say, hey, we'd like to encourage companies to use energy efficient methods and energy efficient buildings and so on and so forth. But under this law, that would not count for the 2% CSR rule. So, this is the interest of time moving forward. I know we're running late for this session. So then there's, what are the modalities of CSR activities? One is that the company could simply donate that 2% to independent NGOs. So almost like outsourcing that CSR spend, right? And I gave it to that NGO. Now the NGO can decide how best to use that in compliance with the law, right? So the NGO becomes kind of a shield protection to the company if somebody says that this is not being spent for whatever. But of course, there are some who might want to keep it in-house. Right? They might want to keep this entire CSR function and managing the spend and all that in-house. So there's obviously that option. And then how they're going to go about it and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for your attention. Found this useful, interesting.
Thank you, Professor Shoda, for this all-inclusive presentation of CSR. And I think every point of your presentation here deserves from us more or less independent research. Looking at it seriously, especially in our community and our present circumstances, I think the social responsibility of a corporation is much more, even more than that. I've been discussing this before the session, and there is one important point which I think is not mentioned here, is profit. How much profit should a corporation make? How much profit should the corporation in our society here should make? I've been discussing this with Professor Soa here, and said that corporation performance here in Egypt, if we measure it by profit, this is quite misleading. Corporations here just increase prices to make higher profit. Nothing to do with efficiency, nothing to do with quality of goods. The responsibility of the corporation towards the consumers. This is quite important now. If I make 200% profit, well, I spend 2% of my profit on social responsibility, and that's it. Doesn't really matter. Even that 2% will be recharged to the customers or the consumers. This is the core of social responsibility in our circumstances, because in fact here, and he has been reading a paper or an essay on the meat problem here in Egypt, اللحمة وأسعار اللحمة. Prices are just going up. I wake up in the morning and say that I'm going to sell at 5% more, 10% more, and that's it, regardless of what quality and what sort of product I'm giving to the customer. So there was a book, I think, issued in the United States 2 or 3 years ago. How much is enough? That's it. How much profit is enough? It's not social responsibility not to destroy the environment, to participate in NGOs, and to participate in social activities and all that. The main responsibility of the corporation is to keep prices down. This is the direct impact on consumers. Participating in social activities perhaps is a good thing, but to sell the product at a very high price without any reason or cause or higher cost or whatever, this is a very serious breach of social responsibility. That is the point I've been talking to with Professor Sohadekran before this session. This deserves certain attention from our researchers, our scholars, and in our society here. This is a very important point. Every day you find higher prices with no justification, just higher prices. The reason behind this, either government regulations are not enough, or government regulations are not applied, or there is certain mafias behind the market which control the price. He was telling me just before that, why not a company say I'm selling at 15, right? I'm going to produce the same product and sell it at 10. You cannot. If you sell at 10, the man behind the scene will destroy you. You cannot sell less than the price which we set for the market. That is the social responsibility, the main social responsibility of the corporation and of the government regulation. I just wanted to mention this. Besides all the points which Professor Sohadekran has mentioned, I think this should be also part of CSR reports. Is the company, in fact, selling at fair prices, or is it exaggerated prices for no reason at all? I think now we can open the floor for any questions for Professor Sohadekran, not for me. Professor Sohadekran will answer a few questions from the floor here. So, I'll start with Professor Abdul who is as old as me. Abdul Right. You can ask your question, please.
Your second point about the financial and social responsibility. You looked at one side of the relationship. What you said was that the result of the research was that the social performance enhances financial performance.
I think they were correlated. Right?
Correlated, okay, correlated. Positively correlated. Positively correlated. There are also other evidence about negative relationships, negative association. So it may be that the relationship is not linear. And in fact, in one study, they found the inverse dual relationship. So if there is an optimal level of social spending and social performance, then we may have a positive relationship if we reach this optimal level, and beyond this it goes down. So that I wanted to make this point. The second point, second brief point is that you correlated social disclosure with the financial performance. Now, substituting disclosure for performance may not be a very good idea. because disclosure is subject, the company is disclosing at its will, especially if it's not audited. It's not audited. So correlating the disclosure with the performance with the is maybe exceeding in this case. I should measure directly and objectively the social activities and involvement, and there is a KD measure which is known in the field, and this is available on a database which is very much objective and weighted also.
I agree with everything you said. As I said, I was just trying to garner together a sampling of the research in this area. You might recall I started my comments by saying this is nowhere close to being comprehensive. You're absolutely right. There are studies that show that there's actually a negative relationship between CSR performance. So that's what I was kind of alluding to in my opening comments, which is for it to be sustainable, company managers must be confident that this is improving their bottom line. In the long run, it may not happen right away, but in the long run, that this is a plus as opposed to a net loss.
And the causality is also another reason.
Correct.
Not close one.
No, I watched.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you. First question, what about the corporate governance report? Are there some differences or differences between corporate governance report and CSR report? Number one. Second question, I'd like to know, are these reports mandatory or voluntary in USA? And finally, question number three, what about the internal editors rule in providing CSR report, especially after SOX Act permit to internal editors provide consultancy services? Thank you.
So I think the first one about governance versus CSR. I see CSR as a much bigger tent or a much bigger umbrella. A lot of things that go into CSR reports in a voluntary environment, right? Now, when you've got a mandatory environment, then bare minimum has to be provided. Your second question was, I think it was about voluntary, right? In the US, it's voluntary. Was that your second question? In the US, for the most part, it's still voluntary, as are the audits. The audits are also voluntary.
CSR report more wide than corporate governance report?
No, that's not what I was saying. I was saying the CSR report is a big tent. It has a lot of things in it. Governance would be in it, supply chain would be in it, energy efficiency would be in it, treatment of labor would be in it. So the CSR report is a much bigger tent, and governance is part of it. Yeah, okay. And CSR reports you see governance.
Second was voluntary, the SR1 report.
In the US, the CSR report is still voluntary.
Yes. The third question about the rule of internal audit department or internal auditors in providing CSR reports.
Just like the financial report, the report is produced internally.
Yeah.
And then one of two things happen after that, either it's audited or it's not audited. But the report, even if you look at some, there is an audit report on the CSR report. It has some parallels to the financial auditor's report. It says, hey, we didn't produce this report. The company produced the report. We are just auditing the report that the company provided. So it's all there. In fact, it's very interesting to bring that up because at that conference in New York last week, there was a gentleman from one of the big four accounting firms, and he said, if they are going to be the auditors of the CSR report for a company, then they provide no advice
on the CSR report. They say if you want consulting services, find somebody else to help you prepare the CSR report. But because of the independence issue, they do not provide any feedback or any input on the CSR report. It's a very clear firewall where the auditor will simply audit whatever CSR report the company provides them. And if the company wants to get help, maybe it's doing it for the first time, the second time, and they need help with producing the CSR report, then it's up to them to either do it through their internal staff or to hire a consultant to prepare them.
Okay, let's have the question, and then there's a question from one of the young researchers here, and that will be good discussion. Yes, please.
So thank you for the interesting presentations. Here we are doing research as well, so this overview. I don't have a question, I have a comment and observation. And that is all of these studies that you describe here are in the area of financial reporting, financial accounting, and audit, plus income tax. And I just wanted to throw out to the audience here that this is also an area that's very relevant to management accounting research. Is it a question of how do companies decide what social and environmental initiatives to pursue? And there's one school of thought that says these efforts are greenwashing. Companies only engage in these efforts to the extent that they also are profitable. There's also others that think otherwise. A few years ago, I sponsored a research study by Mark Epstein, who looked at 5 major companies, including Home Depot, see how they evaluate the trade-off, right, between economic, social, environmental objectives. And the takeaway from that study was that they didn't view them as competing objectives. They viewed them as complementary, and they tried to find ways to meet all 3 objectives: environmental, social, and economic. So this is an area that is very ripe for, I think, intriguing for management accounting researchers. How do managers, how do companies evaluate the trade-offs? I mean, at some point, it's not necessarily a trade-off, but it might be like a low monetary return. This goes back to moderator's point, to pursue environmental and social objectives. It touches on almost every field, every part of management accounting: the budgeting process, performance evaluation, offset systems, transfer pricing. It really impacts all of management accounting. So you got to encourage those in the audience today who are in the management accounting field to possibly think of this as a fertile research area.
Yes, we have the last question here, please. Yes.
I think that community culture and perception of community social responsibility activities is an ignored factor. I think it's need national studies and comparison. What's your opinion about this statement? Understand, Luna? I think that community culture. I think that community culture perception of the importance of corporate social responsibility activities is an important factor that neglected in many studies. And I think it's need an international study comparison between countries. Here in Egypt, I think that the education and culture of Egyptian people not aware of corporate social responsibility. They don't care about what Bank Al-Ahli do in the hospital in the 57 or another thing. But I think this factor is affecting outside other developed countries. Okay, do I agree about this statement? The second statement or the second comment for Dr. Ibrahim Sibai, I think that determining the price of goods determined by other factors like competition, like demand and supply, break-even, not social responsibility play. Thank you. إنه
As I said at the start of my comments, your societies choose whether they want to make this mandatory or voluntary, right? And so really, it's even in a society there may not be agreement on what is appropriate, but like you saw with that law in India, there are lots of companies that are not happy with that law. But such is the political process that they decided they were going to make it mandatory because perhaps they weren't confident that companies would do the right thing. That's a perception, unless there was a law. But in a lot of other countries, it tends to be voluntary. I'm always a little bit kind of shy about the word voluntary, right? And I say that because, if you view it strictly as regulation or no regulation, then you can talk about it voluntary. But if you chose to, like that New Zealand example, if you chose to go to another stock exchange, and that stock exchange requires it, is that voluntary or mandatory? Let's say if a company now goes to a country where it's the law is required, is that voluntary or mandatory? Well, the choice to go to that stock exchange was voluntary, but once they're there, it's not voluntary anymore. So I have a little bit of trouble. So if we keep it simple and say either there is a law, a domestic law that requires it, or there isn't a domestic law. That's, I think, a social choice as to whether. To your other point about comparisons, I think the difficulty over here is controlling the environment so that you're doing apples and apples comparisons, as opposed to, you saw there were a few single country studies in there, China, New Zealand, Canada, and all of that. But when you start comparing across countries, then you have to make sure that you're controlling for a lot of other things. What does the stock exchange require? What does the financial regulator require? What does the labor union require? Right? And that becomes extremely murky for those comparisons. But again, as a young researcher, I think this is an area where there's just a whole host of opportunities. Just one editorial and then I'll stop. I got my PhD in 1986, and my area is international accounting. And I see a lot of parallels with CSR today to international accounting almost 30 years ago. It was hard to get data, it was hard to, the mainstream or the premier journals were not very supportive of the research. But if you have the passion, and that's an area that's important, then you kind of hang in there and you make it happen. You be the leader in the field. So that's the plus side, right? If you can start doing it very early in your career, and this is a nascent field, it's just emerging. Like everything in life, pros and cons. Thank you very much.
All right. I think now we can should thank Professor Sadar on this comprehensive presentation of the researchers in the field of CSR. And I hope that our young researchers here may benefit from this presentation and perhaps will make them think about some points of research in this area. I thank you all for listening, and I thank again Professor Sadar for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Now, there are two sessions in parallel. One is here about corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, and the other one about financial reporting and disclosure. So please be in one of these two rooms. We are running late for 15 minutes, and this will delay the lunch for 15 minutes, but we'll have to take the lunch quicker because we will start the session after around 1 time, please. Thank you.